What sword did Winston Churchill carry? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. So in case you didn't know, as well as being a YouTuber, I am also an antique sword dealer. Link below, incidentally, to Easton Antique Arms, where I sell antique swords. Now, I had a fantastic question from Francis Hunter, and sometimes I get a question which is so good, it's like, I'm going to make a video about that, and I immediately do it. So here it is, and I'm going to keep it relatively concise. So the question is, what sword did Winston Churchill carry when he commissioned into the 4th Hussars, the Queen's Own Hussars, 4th Hussars? And I actually know the answer to this question. It's pretty damned easy to answer because they had a standard pattern of sword which officers buy. Now, bear in mind, not issued. He wasn't issued a sword. He was an officer, so he purchased a sword. So officers purchased their uniforms, their weapons, their revolver, their sword, binoculars, everything else. They purchased absolutely everything. So you had to be pretty wealthy to be an officer in the Victorian period. So when he commissioned, I think it was in 1895, into the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, he purchased, probably from Wilkinson, and I don't know where any of his swords are today, incidentally. Some of them might be floating around in the collector's world, or they might still be owned by the family. They're probably still owned by the family. But essentially, the sword he initially had was this. Now, we are going to talk about other swords because he certainly had other swords during his career. So even though Francis Hunter's question was what sword did he initially have, he only had it for about a year. And there's a reason for that, which I'll get to in a second. So in the Hussars, they are light cavalry. So at this time in the British Army, light cavalry, heavy cavalry, and you also got horse guards. Now, if you were in the light cavalry, you had a certain model of sword. If you were in heavy cavalry, you bought another model of sword. And if you were in the horse guards, such as the 1st or 2nd Life Guards, then you bought yet another model of sword. So there were a few different patterns of sword. However, we'll get to what happens next in a minute. So he was in the Hussars, the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, and he bought one of these. We know he had one of these because it's shown in pictures. Now, as far as I can ascertain from the photographs, it wasn't what this is. This is a patent solid hilt. If you're not sure what that is, I've talked about that in other videos, so just search for patent hilt or patent solid hilt on YouTube or in my videos and you'll find those easily. This is an example of this model of sword which was service sharpened and carried in the Sudan. So this particular sword was actually carried in the 19th Hussars, and it's actually marked on the blade here. But it's the same model of sword. So although this is from 1885 and Churchill would have bought his sword probably in 1895, it was the same model of sword with what we call a 3-bar hilt. Now, he didn't have this sword for very long, or at least he may have kept the same blade, but he didn't keep the hilt for very long. And the reason we know this is we see photos of him later on from the Omdurman campaign in 1898, and he's carrying a different sword. Why is he carrying a different sword in 1898 than the one he was carrying in 1895? Well, quite simply because in 1896, a new pattern of sword came along. In fact, it wasn't a different blade, it was a different hilt. And remember I mentioned before that light and heavy cavalry had different models of hilt or different models of sword. They all got, in 1896, what we sometimes refer to as the Universal Cavalry Officer's Sword of 1896, or simply the 1896 pattern. And it's this hilt here, which is actually based on the heavy cavalry hilt. So heavy cavalry had a guard that looked exactly like this before 1896. They just kept their swords. But people in the light cavalry, like Churchill in the 4th Hussars, had to equip themselves. They didn't have to, but they did, probably for fashion and kudos reasons, update to the new model in 1896, which was this. And it's a more protective hilt, a little bit more symmetrical. It is a bit of an upgrade. You know, often in the military, things which change aren't always better, but I would say this guide is better. The other thing which changes as well with the 1896 pattern is this 1895 pattern back piece or back strap, which is fully checkered and much straighter than the previous one. You'll notice that previously they were only checkered on the thumb placer here and then smooth on this part, and often they're not as straight as even this one, they're a little bit curved. So the sword did change subtly in the hilt, even though the blade didn't really change. It's still the 1845 pattern blade. Hence, Churchill is shown, he's already, by 1898, had two different swords. I mean, he only joined in 1895, so he was in the 4th Hussars. Later, obviously, he was with the charge with the 21st Lancers, when he famously used a broom-handle Mauser because he'd injured his arm or shoulder, and so decided to not use a sword because he decided he wouldn't be very effective with the sword, and so he pulled out his broom-handle Mauser and used that against the Sudanese instead of a sword. But most of the people he was charging alongside with would have gone in with lances and then switched to swords. There we go. So other officers in the 21st Lancers, a lot of them would have had this. Some of them might still have had the 3-bar from before 1896. So by this point, we know Churchill had already had 2 swords, but he had more. Later on, he had various, when he was an older man and a statesman and later on Prime Minister, he had various swords that were used for essentially ceremonial occasions. So we do, for example, see him in a naval uniform wearing a Royal Navy officer's sword, which is still the current pattern in use today, and it's just known as a Royal Navy officer's sword, but it is actually technically the 1846 pattern. Hasn't changed since 1846, except for some minor changes in the early 1900s. The blade became straight and a little bit narrower, but basically it's the same pattern. And he is shown with other swords at other times, but fundamentally these are the main ones. So he started off with one of these 3-bar hilts. He only carried that for like a year or two, and then he switched to the 1896 pattern, which he's shown with in 1898. And later on were all sorts of other swords for ceremonial purposes, probably most notably including the Royal Navy officer's sword. So there we go, there's the answer to the question. I hope that's been interesting, and check out the links below. Hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Thanks for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and I will be again next time. Cheers, folks!